Numbers chapter 9 tonight, 9 and 10. In every dispensation, God has provided his people with everything that is needed, both for life and for godliness. A major portion of God's self-revelation is law. Major portion. We don't read it with the same enthusiasm, I don't think, as we may read other portions of Scripture. But the psalmist declared that it was something marvelous and magnificent, something to be treasured. The law reveals the character and the will of the lawgiver. The law indicts sinners for failing to measure up to the standard that is God himself. After our survey of Genesis, it should be no surprise that mankind is utterly wicked and evil, in theological terms, totally and absolutely depraved. Because of mankind's natural inclination toward evil, God then must instruct his people in righteousness. So he revealed himself in every dispensation, in every age, building upon what was already written, never contradicting earlier revelation, so that in the study of previous revelation, we have the full picture. To neglect the study of the Old Testament would be like just studying the top portion of an iceberg. To study the New Testament without the Old Testament would be like getting in on Romeo and Juliet in the fifth act without seeing the first four. Taken together, the Scriptures give us everything that we need for life and for godliness. They reveal God and his will and God's purpose in all things. And this picture would be woefully incomplete without the law. So while these chapters, Exodus 21 through Numbers 10, may not be the most scintillating or the most dramatic section of Scripture, it is foundational to the story of redemption, and it is critical for an understanding of what is to come. I didn't go back and count how many sermons it's taken us since Exodus 21. It's by no means been an exhaustive study, although we have almost read every single word in the text. It's not been a flyover by any means. We've been down in the trenches, we've been down close and personal with the text, asking it questions, squeezing all that we could get out of it, all the theology, all of the application that we could get out of it in the short time that we had. On a personal note, this has been challenging for me. It's been very challenging. There's been a lot to digest week by week by week by week, and the question is always, what do I bring to the pulpit? What do I share with you, and what do I leave out on the cutting room floor? Law, as I've found, and as you've probably noticed, is not easy to preach. It's not always directly applicable. It's not easy to preach, and then we're doing large sections of law here. My hope was to keep the larger picture in mind, not to be too involved with details. I apologize for times when these sermons might have been dry and boring and wearisome. The fault's my own, it's not the text. Now that I have a better handle on it all, I'm ready to go back and write through this. I'm ready to even go back someday and teach through this again. Now, as for Numbers itself, this is a unique book. This is totally extraordinary, very unique. As we've noted, many of the events in the first 10 chapters are repeated from earlier books, but they include additional information. Certain days are revisited to add events that have not yet been discussed, and even more challenging, as we've spoken of, the narrative all of a sudden is interrupted by more law. And so you get going with a nice narrative, it starts to get interesting and dramatic again, and all of a sudden you have 2 or 3 chapters of law interrupting the text. And it's not always immediately apparent why Moses ordered the material this way. Now, tonight, in studying Numbers 9 and 10, our chapters before us, we're going to see 4 actions of God on behalf of his people. 4 actions as God leads his people to the promised land, true of the church as well as we travel to the heavenly city. God was preparing his people to march. 1 year prior, they had eaten the Passover in readiness to depart from Egypt. And after 11 months of preparations now, there were a few more preparations left to facilitate a massive nation of people marching across the desert. Such attention is given to the camps and the marching because this is a huge undertaking. It would be like having all of the population of Chicago proper which I was surprised to learn is only 2.5 million people. It'd be like having all of Chicago proper camping together out in the wilderness, or more perspective, everyone in the St. Louis metro area out on a camp out together. This is massive. I don't think I ever fully appreciated just how many people we're talking about. This is a lot of people living together and now getting ready to move together. And so we saw the organization that each tribe had a leader, that each leader had men under him, and that those men had men under them, and so on and so forth, until you get essentially a local and a nationalized government. They had leaders on every level, leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, leaders of tens. And these leaders were responsible for maintaining the efficiency of the camp. Before they moved out from the Sinai Peninsula, where they'd been camped now for 11 months, while being given the law and the priesthood, the tabernacle, the sacrifices, and the arrangement of their camps, 1 year after the Passover, the first Passover, they're ready to move. But there's something coming up, something very important that they must do. They must observe the second Passover. Because of God's grace, they will actually pause for 1 more month before they move out. So we see first, number one, I don't have a PowerPoint for this because of earlier. Number one, God gives grace to his people. God gives grace to his people. The first 14 verses. Look at verse 1. Thus the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. We might better relate to this as April the 1st, 1444 BC. April the 1st, 1444 BC. The first month of the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt. The Exodus had occurred exactly 1 year prior to this. It was so pivotal of an event that God had commanded Israel to make that month the very first month on the calendar. And so now they had spent most of the year in the wilderness of Sinai receiving the covenant and the law from the Lord. And now Moses spoke again to Moses saying, verse 2, now let the sons of Israel observe the Passover at its appointed time. Just because they were in the wilderness preparing to make the journey to the promised land was not an excuse to skip the celebration of the Passover. The Passover had been instituted by God as a required observance year by year. All were required to observe it. Those who did not were to be cut off out of Israel. Thus, the observant would be distinct from the unobservant. The faithful would be distinct from the unfaithful. Those who truly believe in the Lord God and whose allegiances lie with him will observe all that the Lord commands. And this is true in every age. Remember, Jesus in John 14 said, whoever keeps my commandments is the one who what? Is the one who loves me. Those who sincerely obeyed and observed the Passover were the ones who loved the Lord. And this was the law concerning Passover. Verse 3, on the 14th day of this month at twilight, you shall observe it at its appointed time. You shall observe it according to all its statutes and according to all its ordinances. They could not observe it at any time or in any way that they pleased. Passover had to be celebrated on a certain day in remembrance of a specific event, God's deliverance of them from Egypt. And the rest of these instructions, you'll remember, were recorded for posterior generations in Exodus 12, and they had to be followed exactly. The worship of God is serious business, and this is what we've continually seen in the Torah. It's serious. We can't go about it any way that we choose, but we do according to what God has prescribed. Verse 4, so Moses told the sons of Israel to observe the Passover. They observed the Passover in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses, so the sons of Israel did. But there was a problem. Verse 6, there were some men who were unclean because of a dead person, so that they could not observe Passover on that day. You remember that to touch a dead person, and I was reading forward, and I think somewhere in Deuteronomy it actually says to even be in the same tent as a corpse makes one defiled, ritually unclean, so that you have to spend a week outside of the camp away from the presence of the Lord. So the people avoided dead bodies as best as they could, but that's not always possible. The reality is someone has to take care of the dead. Thus they would care for the corpses of their close relatives, and in so doing they would become unclean. There was also the danger of being somewhere and accidentally coming into contact with a corpse. Those who were unclean then could not celebrate the Passover because they could not enter into the tabernacle in order to do one of the main things of Passover, sacrifice a lamb. They were unable to do that. These men, however many there were, the text doesn't say, had no way to avoid becoming unclean. As I was thinking through this and looking at the timing of it all, I started to think, it's possible that these men were the ones who carried Nadab and Abihu out of the tabernacle. That seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? But if you look at the dates, it's only been about a week since that's happened. It's amazing how the Torah has been structured, and it just feels like Leviticus 10 was, for us, months ago. Now these men desired to observe the Passover. Verse 6, so they came before Moses and Aaron on that day. Verse 7, those men said to him, though we are unclean because of the dead person, why are we restrained from presenting the offering of the Lord at its appointed time among the sons of Israel? Moses therefore said to them, wait, and I will listen to what the Lord will command concerning you. It is important to note this. Moses did not say, hey, you know what? I think you're right. That's a valid point. Come on in. Let's get you a lamb. We'll get you to the altar and you can sacrifice. No. Moses went and he inquired of the Lord, because Moses is not the Lord of the Passover. We all know this. God is. Moses did not prescribe laws concerning worship or life in Israel. God did. We need to be very careful, first, to know God's commands, second, to do God's commands, and third, not to presume on God. Presuming God's will when it is not recorded for us is a dangerous thing. In Numbers, some of the narratives here are going to demonstrate that, but this is not one of them. Because Moses goes in and speaks to the Lord. Verse 9, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if any one of you or of your generations becomes unclean because of a dead person or is on a distant journey, he may, however, observe the Passover to the Lord. Note the Lord's loving kindness here. In addition to the stipulation, unprovoked, he adds that someone can be on a long journey, unable to come and sacrifice and observe the Passover. But look at what comes next, verse 11. In the second month, on the 14th day at twilight, they shall observe it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until morning, nor break a bone of it. According to all the statute of the Passover, they shall observe it. It's so easy to get overwhelmed in the Torah with dates, and these books are very difficult sometimes, and things get passed over. No pun intended. Note the date in verse 11. The second month and the 14th day, if you want a Julian date for that, it would be May 1st of 1444. 1 month later than Passover. 1 month later. God allowed those who were unable to partake in the celebration of the Passover on its normal date due to unavoidable uncleanness or travel in order to celebrate it exactly 1 month later and exactly in the same manner as they had before. The late date for the Passover will come into play a few times here in the Old Testament, but this still did not mean that they could just skip the Passover. Well, so-and-so is having a party that day. I don't feel like going to the Passover. Well, that didn't count. Has to be unavoidable uncleanness or a journey. Verse 13, but the man who is clean and is not on a journey and yet neglects to observe the Passover, that person shall then be cut off from his people, for he did not present the offering of the Lord at its appointed time. That man will bear his guilt. If an alien sojourns among you and observes the Passover to the Lord according to the statute of the Passover and according to its ordinance, so he shall do. You shall have one statute, both for the alien and for the native of the land. So both Jews and Gentiles alike who lived in Israel were to observe the Passover on penalty of excommunication. Israel was to be faithful to God. Those who were not were to be cut off from the land. And the purity of the church, as we all know in our age, is just as important. Now note how exacting their observance of the Passover was to be, and yet how God's grace still had room to function. Law and grace, law as it should be understood, law and grace are not opposed to one another as some suppose. In the same way today, we have some trouble often understanding how obedience and grace fit together. But they do. They do. They fit together, for the same God who gives grace also demands obedience. Yet how glad we are for his grace when we fail to obey. A correct understanding of law understands the character of the God of the law. The God of the law who is righteous, who is holy, who is just, yet who is loving, who is kind, and who is gracious. In fact, the law was meant to teach God's righteousness. It was meant to teach God's grace and his kindness in forgiving sins. These attributes are not opposed to one another in the character of God. Rather, they inform one another and they work together. The law was meant to inform us about God's nature in contrast to ours, and to teach the redeemed what holiness looks like. Right? The law was never meant to save. That the law was something that you did in order to be righteous in God's sight was something that was a false view of the law that came in later. Yes, if you did all the law, you would be righteous in God's sight, but the whole point is nobody can. But also it teaches sanctification to the redeemed people. We are saved only by God's grace through faith. Now, number 2, in verse 15, God dwells among his people. God dwells among his people. God gives grace to his people. God dwells among them. Verse 15. Now we move backwards in time 13 days to expand yet again on a momentous event that Moses has already described for us many times. God's presence covered Mount Sinai through most of the months that Israel was encamped by the mountain. But since God was going to take them to the promised land to be their king, he needed to move with them. So you remember they built a sanctuary, the tabernacle, according to the pattern that God showed Moses on Mount Sinai. This tabernacle was patterned after the heavenly dwelling place of God. And God then filled the completed tabernacle with his presence, with his glory. Verse 15, now on the day that the tabernacle was erected, that is the first day of the first month in the second year, according to Exodus 40, Julian date would be Wednesday, March 19th, 1444 BC. I did not calculate these. I have a book where somebody went through years of trouble to calculate these, and we benefit from it. That's March 19th, 1444 BC. The cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and in the evening it was like the appearance of fire over the tabernacle until morning. So it was continuously. The cloud would cover it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud was lifted from over the tent, afterward the sons of Israel would then set out. And in the place where the cloud settled down, there the sons of Israel would camp. At the command of the Lord, the sons of Israel would set out, and at the command of the Lord they would camp. As long as the cloud settled over the tabernacle, they remained camped. Even when the cloud lingered over the tabernacle for many days, the sons of Israel would keep the Lord's charge and not set out. If sometimes the cloud remained a few days over the tabernacle, according to the command of the Lord they remained camped. Then according to the command of the Lord they set out. If sometimes the cloud remained from evening until morning, when the cloud was lifted in the morning, they would move out. Or if it remained in the daytime and at night, whenever the cloud was lifted, they would set out. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a year that the cloud lingered over the tabernacle, staying above it, the sons of Israel remained camped and did not set out. But when it was lifted, they did set out. At the command of the Lord they camped, and at the command of the Lord they set out. They kept the Lord's charge according to the command of the Lord through Moses. Here, as you can tell, the emphasis of the text is that they did as God commanded them to do. God moved, they moved. God settled down, they camped. God moved, they settled down, they camped. If God stayed there for months, they stayed there for months. If God kept them moving, they kept moving, no matter how long. The emphasis of the text is that God is there leading and guiding them. Thus, Israel was learning to trust God. They were learning to trust his direction and to trust his timing. He was leading them through the wilderness, dictating when they were moving, when they were camping. And now all that we have left is for the people to be organized a little bit more and set out. So Numbers chapter 10, setting out for the first time. We've seen that not only does God move with his people, God gives grace to his people, God, number 3, organizes his people. God organizes his people. A crowd of people moves slowly. If you've been to a baseball game or to the zoo on a busy day, you know this. A crowd of people does not move quickly, and if they move quickly, it's usually disastrous. Attempting to get a group of people to move together and in the right direction is almost impossible. It's almost like herding kittens. It just does not work. So here, in order to manage the people, then God commands the fashioning of 2 trumpets. Numbers chapter 10, verse 1. The Lord spoke further to Moses, saying, Make yourself 2 trumpets of silver, of hammered work you shall make them, and you shall use them for summoning the congregation and for having the camp set out. When both are blown, all the congregation shall gather themselves to you at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Yet if only one is blown, then the leaders, the heads of the divisions of Israel, shall assemble before you. But when you blow an alarm, the camps that are pitched on the east side shall set out. When you blow an alarm the second time, the camps that are pitched on the south side shall set out. An alarm is to be blown for them to set out. When convening the assembly, however, you shall blow without sounding an alarm. The priestly sons of Aaron, moreover, shall blow the trumpets, and this shall be for you a perpetual statute throughout your generations. When you go to war in your land against the adversary who attacks you, then you shall sound an alarm with the trumpets, that you may be remembered before the Lord your God and be saved from your enemies. Also in the day of your gladness and in your appointed feasts and on the first days of your months, you shall blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, and they shall be a reminder of you before your God. I am the Lord your God. As I was reading that, I was thinking about how amazing the layout of this section is, and it's starting to come together, I guess, in my mind, because I'm thinking about how the text moves topically from the most important thing, right? The law, Exodus 21 through 23, and it moves into the next important thing, right? The tabernacle. Then it moves into the priests, and then it moves into the fact that all these things were done just as the Lord commanded. Then it moves into the sacrifices, Leviticus 1 through 5, and then it moves into the ordination of the priests. You have to have people to function in the tabernacle, and it all logically progresses so that as we're starting to see how all this works out, we've gotten it topically from most important now to the most, even some of the most practical of the things. And so we've gone even through Numbers 1, where they've arranged the camps, Numbers 2 and 3, where they arrange the Levites and they decide how they're going to order themselves. And then we saw the Passover, and now the last thing really left to do is to get the people moving. And how do they do that? Well, the text tells us they do it by trumpet call. Moses is really a master at writing and organizing material. So thus the trumpets signaled both the summoning and dismissal of the people. They were able to distinguish various trumpet calls. These trumpets were to be used in war for a very special purpose, to call the Lord to watch them, to remember them, and to give them victory. Not that the Lord needed help remembering them, but this signaled to the people that God did indeed remember them and was with them. They were also to blow the trumpets on the feast days or on the first days of the month, and it was a reminder of them before God. They were always God conscious, and thus they were always conscious that God was watching over them. All they had to do was call upon him. Now, trumpets, and we don't have time to get into this, trumpets do play a large part in biblical narrative, in biblical theology and events. Just one point here, even at the great event that each and every one of us is awaiting, the trumpet will sound, and we will all instantly be changed and caught up to the Lord in the air. I remember it was actually last summer we were going through 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and the rapture. And we were talking about that and comparing it with 1 Corinthians 15, where it says that the last trumpet will be sounded. And in the commentaries, I remember wading through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages about what in the world is the last trumpet. And they were trying to match it all over the place with trumpets in Revelation. But the problem is you can never exactly get a last trumpet because it can't be the last trumpet in Revelation because it doesn't make sense. And any other last trumpet just wasn't the last trumpet. And so I remember one view of this was, well, it's going back to these chapter or this section in Numbers. And it's talking about, well, the movement of the camps. That the first camp would move, then the second camp would move, then the third camp would move, and the fourth camp would move, all at the sound of its individual trumpet sound. Well, what happens at the rapture? The dead in Christ rise first, and we are also changed, and we meet the Lord in the air. Some of the commentaries propose, well, the first trumpet is for those who are already past. And then the second trumpet is for us who are alive. Something to think through. Just interesting that trumpets always seem to play a major portion or a major part in biblical events. Well, God organizes his people. God leads his people. Number 4, God leads his people. Everything now in place, the people are ready to move. After the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were finished, God removed his presence from the tabernacle. Verse 11, now the second year in the second month, on the 20th of the month, that's May 7th of 1444 BC, the cloud was lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony. And the sons of Israel set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. So they moved out for the first time according to the commandment of the Lord through Moses. The standard of the camp of the sons of Judah, according to their armies, set out first with Nashon, the son of Amminadab, over its army, and Nethanel, the son of Zuar, over the tribal army of the sons of Issachar, and Eliav, the son of Helon, over the tribal army of the sons of Zebulun. I'm getting payback for not reading any of those names in Acts this morning. That was the camp of Judah, consisting of the tribes of Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. They set out first, just as they were instructed to do in Numbers chapter 2. And if you'll remember, they had 186,400 males, along with their families, along with their livestock and possessions. This is a lot of people moving all at once, with a lot of things going with them. Verse 17, next the tabernacle was taken down, and the sons of Gershon and the sons of Merari, who were carrying the tabernacle, set out. Thus the tabernacle itself went second, carried by the 30 to 50-year-old males of Gershon and Merari. This is so that the tabernacle then would be set up by the time they got to wherever they were going to camp, and all the things that went into the tabernacle arrived. As 5,830 workers, according to Numbers 3 or 4, along with their families, possessions, livestock, they all set out. Verse 18, next the standard of the camp of Reuben, according to their armies, set out with Elizur, the son of Shedeur, over its army, and Shalumiel, the son of Jerusadai, over the tribal army of the sons of Simeon. And Eliasaph, the son of Duel, was over the tribal army of the sons of Gad. So Reuben, Simeon, and Gad, along with all of their 151,450 men, plus their livestock, plus their families and possessions, all set out. Verse 21, then the Kohathites set out, carrying the holy objects, and the tabernacle then was set up for their arrival. Thus 2,750 Kohathites, along with all of their families, possession, livestock, set out, carrying the altars, the tables, all of those things. Verse 22, next the standard of the camp of the sons of Ephraim, according to their armies, was set out, with Elishama, the son of Ammihud, over its army, and Gamaliel, the son of Pedazur, over the tribal army of the sons of Manasseh, and Abidan of the sons of Gideoni, over the tribal army of the sons of Benjamin. These tribes totaled 108,100 men, along with all of their families, livestock, possessions. Then, verse 25, the standard of the camp of the sons of Dan, according to their armies, which formed the rear guard for all the camps, set out, with Ahiezer, the son of Ammishaddai, over its army, and Pagiel, the son of Ochran, over the tribal army of the sons of Asher, and Ahira, the son of Enan, over the tribal army of the sons of Naphtali. This was the order of march of the sons of Israel by the armies as they set out. And of course, Dan with its other two tribes set out with 157,600 men plus all of their families and belongings. Verse 29. Then Moses said to, here's a name for you, Hobab, the son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. I always imagine Hobab being from Mississippi. We are setting out to the place of which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will do you good. For the Lord has promised good concerning Israel. Hobab was probably Zipporah's uncle. That's Moses' wife's uncle. Reuel was Moses' grandfather-in-law. And you remember Jethro was Moses' father-in-law. Hobab must have been Jethro's father. Jethro must have been Hobab's father. I'm getting confused. There are so many names here. Okay. You have Reuel, the grandfather. He has two sons, Hobab and Jethro. And then Jethro is the father of Zipporah, who married Moses. That all makes sense? Maybe it does to you. I'm from a small family. None of this makes sense. So Moses invited Hobab and promised to treat him well in the promised land. Hence, we are reminded that the promise is not just for the people of Israel, it is for all people who pledge their allegiance to God by faith. Verse 30, he said to him, I will not come. That is, Hobab said to Moses, I will not come, but rather will go to my own land and relatives. Then he said, please do not leave us, inasmuch as you know where we should camp in the wilderness, and you will be as eyes for us. So it will be, if you go with us, that whatever good the Lord does for us, we will do for you. Though Hobab demurred, Moses insisted that he come so that he could help them navigate some of the difficult parts of the wilderness. Goodness. So even though God was guiding them supernaturally by the cloud by day and the fire by night, he provided someone who had the experience in the wilderness to guide his people with practical matters. And we know from Judges, specifically Judges 1:16 and 4:11, it's mentioned twice there, Hobab did agree to go with Israel through the entirety of the 40 years. The entire 40 years he went with Israel, and even after Moses died, went into the land of promise. I would say that he truly believed in God. Verse 33, thus they set out from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey with the ark of the covenant of the Lord journeying in front of them for the 3 days to seek out a resting place for them. The cloud of the Lord was over them by day when they set out from the camp. And then it came about when the ark set out that Moses said, rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who flee before you, or let those who hate you flee before you. When it came to rest, he said, return, O Lord, to the myriad thousands of Israel. So the Ark of the Covenant, symbolizing God's presence as the king, leading his people on toward the promised land, was going forth before them as a great and mighty warrior. Thus we see that God is a personal and a personable God. He's not distant. He's near to his people. He relates to us, and he desires to be everything to us. These chapters contain a picture of the overall purpose of God. Through revelation of his holiness and by the bestowal of his grace, God grants us fellowship with him and the manifestation of his presence as he leads us through the wilderness towards the holy city. God gives us grace. God moves with us. God organizes us by his grace, and he leads us. All we must do is trust him and obey. We must let go of our fears, our anxieties, and trust him, lean on him. If he was able to do so many great things for Israel in the middle of nowhere, isn't he able to do such great things for us? All we need to do is call out to him, and he will not withhold any good thing from us, because we serve a God of grace, a God of loving kindness and faithfulness who loves us. He has put us into the church in this age. He has organized us into one body, his church, whom he indwells and whom he gives a great inheritance. And through his Son, Jesus, he has called us, the church, and he will send Jesus to gather us, the church, blowing the trumpet that we may be with him forever in the heavenly city. And then we will gaze on the face of God forever and ever. Not just a cloud, not just a fire. We will see those things according to Revelation 22. We're going to see that. But we're going to gaze at the face of God, said Jesus. I can't wait for that. Can't wait to be there with him, with everyone we love. Father, thank you for these chapters that remind us that indeed you are a God of grace. You are righteous and holy, but yet, according to that, you are also graceful. You are also merciful. And God, we're so grateful for that. Thank you that you are with us even to the end of the age. May Christ come soon to rescue us, to take us out of this place. In Jesus' name, amen.